Today, we're getting busty. How do and welcome back to Morrigan's Creations. I'm Mark, and like I said in the intro, today we're going to be painting this bust from Yedharo. But before we can begin painting, I need to fix this bend in his staff. To do this, I simply heat up the resin with a hairdryer and bend his staff back into shape. To prep the model for painting, I airbrush a couple of coats of Vallejo's black primer. This is going to give our paint something to stick to. I could have used a rattle can, but I didn't. I decided to paint this bust a little differently, spraying on a very dark version of my mid-tone to map out the colours. I did this because I've seen other people do it, and I like to copy people's homework. After all, if it worked for them, then it must work for me. The same process was done for the skin, cloak and the headdress, simply switching my colours from green to red-brown and finally a blue-grey. Now comes the fun part, which is the brush painting. I began painting an initial layer using a slightly lighter version of the paint I used in the airbrush. I'm pretty sure this was Lauren Forest with a drop of Abaddon Black. And I'm painting this on about 95% of the areas I previously covered. As we build our way towards our true mid-tone, I'm going to start adding some small amounts of moot green after every couple of coats. This is going to create a nice smooth transition. At this point I am still ensuring to connect all of the muscles in order to avoid a floating effect. One key thing to note is that as I'm highlighting, I begin to focus my brighter colours towards the centre of the model, as though I am painting a cylinder. I then began to introduce some Cadian flesh tone into the green as my highlights, particularly in areas where there is high blood flow like the face and areas on the chest. At this point, this is where I can start to introduce textures and to single out individual muscles. For any areas where my transitions were a little rough, I watered down some moot green into a glaze and softened the transitions. This also gives a slight boost to the saturation of the skin. When painting a model like this, I think it's important to avoid burnout. So when I complete a larger area like the skin, I tend to move on to smaller areas like the mouth. Having these little wins help keep me motivated, as I can see that I am actually progressing with the model. After painting the mouth, eyes and adding some final touches to the skin, I then tackled the headdress. Now there is actually nothing really complicated here. I do this in about 3 different steps. I began with a layer of tenebrous grey and medium grey. I could have just used dark reaper here, but I had these to hand. For the second layer, I then came in and added a bit more of that medium grey to the previous mix. I was working with some thinner lines here, but when I finally got to the final highlights, I did decide to move to a thinner brush. Quick tip, when it comes to painting lines, I think it's easier to paint towards yourself. In order to add some depth to the feathers, I made a glaze of my mid-tone, and I simply pushed this around on the model, focusing it more to the bottom of each feather. This is just going to help make them look a little less flat. Now I'm not actually going to go into any detail on how I paint non-metallic metal. I think I'm going to save that for another video, so I'm just going to have a short montage going through how I did the gold. With the gold now painted, I then turn my attention to the cloak. I'm going to start by doing a mix of tenebrous grey and whole red. Just like with the skin, I'm going to be painting about 95% of the surface I previously covered with the airbrush. In my experience, whole red always has a tendency to dry a lot darker, so on the camera you can't actually see much of it after it's dry. But as I work up, I begin adding some more of that whole red from AK Interactive, this time focusing only on areas that would be touched by the light. Much like with the skin tone, I then decide to add in some Cadian flesh tone to help balance out the model. After all, leather is also skin. Once again, I'm going to be painting this mainly on the upward facing areas of the cloak, before adding in a little bit more flesh tone, before adding some scratchy highlights that are going to help us read as leather. In order to add a deepness to the skin, I then went ahead and sprayed some Leviathan purple through my airbrush at the lower facing areas of the skin. I did this because I liked how the purple was going to contrast with the green to create a nice dramatic shadow. Here I am just painting up the stones, which is actually redundant because it gets covered up by the OSL lighting effects. But I decided to keep this in the video as it shows you exactly how I approach painting stone. Also, it makes the video a little bit longer. You're welcome, by the way. I didn't want to spend ages painting the staff, so I decided to paint the extreme highlights using some Ushabti bone, watered down with, as you guessed, a little bit of water. By watering it down, some areas have more pigment than others, which is quite handy when it comes to the next step. The next step being spraying the model with more contrast paint. First I decided to use some snakebite leather, but I didn't like the look of it, so I came back with some wildwood. I wanted my Shaman to appear as though he was mid-cast, whilst also showing that the stones are the source of his power. To do this, I made a wash using white oil paint and some odourless thinner. This was then applied to all of the runes across all of the stones. I wasn't too sure how much glow I wanted the runes to have, so I did go ahead and paint a layer of fluorescent magenta over the runes. But after waiting for it to dry, I was a little disappointed. So I decided to come back in with my airbrush and spray this across all areas I'd previously painted magenta. I also wanted some of this light to appear on the skin, so I made sure to spray some over the lower parts of the ribs. With this now done, I can load up some of that fluorescent paint into my airbrush and spray over the previously highlighted areas. This just adds a bit of colour to the glowing effect. Arguably I was a little bit heavy-handed here, but I think it turned out just nice. To finish off, I then made another mix of my oil wash, and I applied this once again to all of the runes. This just takes it the extra step and makes it appear as though they truly are glowing and they are the source of the OSL. With everything finally painted, I think it is time to show off the model in all its glory. So let's go ahead and take a look.